Dick Sharp walked into the Forrester lobby with his heart racing as the crystal lights poured down like a cold rain, believing that today would be nothing but joy and applause for the love he had just protected with so much effort. His steps lightened by the sudden pride at the thought of Remy Price standing beside him, at the arms that seemed strong enough to withstand all doubt. But the thin air under the glass dome was cracking with secretive eyes, half-nods, and drawn-out breaths like strings waiting to break. Electra Forrester appeared like a sharp knife, not because of the hand-embroidered dress that hugged her curves, but because every muscle on her face tried to stay calm so as not to shudder when remembering the series of images that had been swapped, the deepfake photos that Remy created to bend reality. Tie the rope of guilt around her neck, and then jerk it right when she leaned weakly, so that he would appear as a life buoy, so that he would become the only one who understood her, so that he would turn her pain into a springboard for the path to another person's heart. Dick heard Remy's name ring in his chest like a chipped bell. At first just a strange ringing in the glitzy crowd, but then each word from Electra poured out like hail, hitting flesh, leaving invisible bruises. Remy had followed Electra to Los Angeles not by chance. Remy had stood between dark windows and kept an eye on her life like an instinctive watchman. Remy had colored the dim spaces with a sparkling story of coincidence, so that anyone who touched him would believe he had just happened to pass by a moment of hurt and reached out at the right moment. Will Spencer stood like a tidal bore, his stern face casting a shadow of unspoken command over the glass as he blocked Remy's path the moment Electra backed away. And everyone realized that what was brewing was no longer an awkward conversation at the welcoming party, but a storm with a center at the heart of Forrester Creations, where all the lights were not enough to clear the fog of anger. Ivy Forrester caught the movement quickly, her tailor's knife eyes scanning every thread of truth and seeing the fox's eye hidden under the shiny satin. Because Ivy knew Electra had spent long nights braiding her hair in the dark, knew her hand trembled as she drew the curtains, and imagined behind the glass a shadow that laughed, that breathed, that memorized her every step, knew that Remy was not only good at picking up the heartbeat of his victims, but also at setting it to music he composed. Dick still wanted to believe that the story could be different, that love could be a shield, that Remy had been the one to come to him with a cleansed heart. But jagged, broken details emerged. The times Remy had been absent without reason, the texts that came and went like an underground stream, and Luna Nozawa had plunged a cold knife into the back of his neck when someone had accidentally whispered on the white carpet, making Dick understand that he wasn't the only one Remy had been dating under the tree, that Remy had been secretly meeting Luna as if all boundaries were just thin chalk lines. Remy pulled Dick to a hidden corner of the gallery, where the new frames hadn't been hung yet, where the smell of new fabric and glue reminded him of things about to be finished, to beg for a chance to do it again, to erase the past like a streak of chalk that could be wiped away, to believe that a hug would make up for it. But that plea passed through a dense maze of Electra, of Will, of Ivy, of Luna, of even the quiet employees who chose to stand on the side of order. And all of them combined into an invisible railing that pushed Dick away, looking at Remy like a statue without a mouth or nose, only cracks that recorded time and lies. Remy tried to hold onto the moment, to remember the nights he and Dick had spent on rooftops watching the streets. To remember the promise of leaving the bad things behind, to remember the changed heart. But will lunge forward like an arrow made of responsibility and victim memory, making it clear that Remy was not welcome. And Will's words were like a lock on the Forrester door, connected to Ivy's steely gaze, and the silent nods from the invisible council of people who had seen Electra cower under a shadow that followed like smoke. The chase broke out as Electra accidentally backed away across the stretch of light that stretched like a stage. Remy just kept close, his shoulders heaving with both regret and desire for control, and Will tore the distance with a straight charge that turned the empty space into a wall of identity. In front of him was a man who had used software to recreate reality to fit his ambition. Behind him was a woman who had been bent into a twisted shape. And beside him, Dick trembled like an overstretched string. A warm sigh filled the air when the name Luna Nozawa emerged again like an oil slick on water, adding to the smell of burning. Because the furtiveness made every promise Remy made look like a forged signature, made every real photo of him with Dick look like a deepfake. Because the foundation was rotten. In another corner of the city, Sheila Sharp left her small kitchen counter with a steely determination, pressing into Deacon Sharp's mind the idea of a complete healing, a cosmically orchestrated feast because Hope Logan and Liam Spencer's wedding was fast approaching. And if ever there was a stage big enough for a rejected mother to be proven, it was that day. A child named Beth Spencer could see how adults change, could take a chance. But life is not easy to indulge in simulated graces. And Beth understood that a safe boundary had to be erected like a fence of light around Hope and Liam's happiness. Beth enters the story like a gentle but decisive hand, ready to stop Sheila's every plan for a bow before it turns into a handful of thorns. And her decision spreads like an urgent message to everyone who loves the bride and groom, that pure love does not need an intervening performance of redemption, that any healing, if any, must begin elsewhere at another time by consistent actions, not one-off appearances. Back in Forrester, the air was as thick as melted plastic, as Remy was pinned to the floor with a pattern of light sweeping across like a blade. Will like a shield, knowing that sometimes compassion and determination must go hand in hand. Electra stood straight, as if she had just learned her own posture. Ivy held the room with the steely stillness of a designer who knew exactly what part of the fabric to cut out to make a dress stand perfectly, and Dick stood in the middle of it all, falling apart, realizing he had wanted to show off to someone he didn't understand, had invited a storm to the party, had placed his heart on a display table like a sample for others to touch and then withdraw with a vague smile. Remy looked around, trying to find a way out of the story, trying to dig into his memory of real moments he had with Dick to prove that everything wasn't completely fabricated. But every face before him reflected fake pictures that had pierced other people's flesh, and the cruelest rejection wasn't Will's hard voice or Ivy's cold gaze, but Dick's slight pause when he was startled to see Luna's name appear in the appointment calendar, in the short announcement, in the scent that lingered on Remy's collar. Remy's ego snarled for survival, throwing out manufactured explanations, but in the place where there was no dialogue, where every sound was crushed into a breath, the truth emerged through the choices that were happening. Electra raised her chin. No longer a victim, but a survivor, Will took a step back to let Dick come forward, because if anyone needed to make the first judgment, it had to be the one who had put his honor on the line for Remy. Ivy kept her hand on the intercom to call security if necessary, and the Forresters stood in a silent line like a frame for a new painting, where Remy was no longer the focus but just an ink stain to be wiped away. In another radius, Sheila still painted the path to the wedding with wildflowers of hope, but Beth's shadow blocked the path, and Deacon understood that there were things that needed to be healed in silence, that the desire to prove herself in public could sometimes be the knife that tore the fragile veil that had just been woven. The storm at Forrester turned into a crescendo when Remy unconsciously reached out as if to pull Electra closer, a reflex ingrained in her sweet possessiveness, and Will squeezed Remy's shoulder, forcing him to look straight into Electra's face, no longer tear-streaked but shining like a freshly wiped mirror. Dick stepped forward at the same time, not to defend, but to see closely what name had been engraved on his heart. Remy, or the sparkling loneliness that had fooled him all along. And as silence fell like a velvet curtain in the theater waiting for the play to turn, a flickering image loomed at the end of the hallway, where the green emergency light cast a cold streak of light. A framed photo advertising the new collection, reflecting Electra's face over Remy's in an odd superimposition, like the deepfakes that had once frightened her, like a sign that even if erased, the cracks would remain further away. The announcement of Hope and Liam's wedding preparations rang out from someone's phone, reminding everyone of another world waiting to be kept safe from the shadows that wanted to get in, reminding them of Beth as a line that could not be crossed. Finally, all the movement froze in a single frame, Dick standing in the middle, his hands shaking slightly, his eyes leaving Remy to rest on Electra as if apologizing for almost turning the victim into a backdrop for a beautiful fantasy love story, Will lowering his chin, taking the position of a guard without showing off his muscles, Ivy tilting her head to calculate the logistics of getting this storm out of the building with minimal damage. Remy blinking at the circle closing around her and understanding that the doors were not just closed because of guilt, but because people had learned their lesson. And in the other corner, Sheila turned off her phone screen as Beth sent a short message like a ban, causing the dream of intruding on someone else's happy day to disappear. But when the lights dimmed for a moment and then came back on, the cold question still hung like a hair across the blade of a knife. If tomorrow another photo appeared that was so perfect that it was impossible to distinguish between real and fake, would Dick's fragile heart, which had just learned to defend itself, recognize that the person behind the lens was Remy, or the darkness in everyone who preferred to believe in what they desired rather than what was bleeding before their eyes? Thomas Forrester returns to Los Angeles like a headwind, carrying the weight of his past and his own uncertainty. No one knows what face he will return as: a haunted madman, a desperate lover, or a man who has hit rock bottom and is looking for a way to be reborn. Matthew Atkinson emerges from behind the scenes with a burning gaze, leaving behind Thomas's years of struggling between genius and out of control. The first footage reveals him emerging from the lights of Forrester Creations, as quiet as a trail of smoke, where everyone believed he had retreated forever. But what Thomas brings back is not just a figure, but an emotional storm the smell of gunpowder from conflicts that have never been extinguished, a reminder that in the world of power, fashion, and love, no one is truly healed. Ridge Forrester had believed that marrying Brooke Logan would end the family rift, but when Thomas's eyes met Brooke's, everything inside him collapsed again. The anger that had burned him, the suppressed anger, masked by a false calm, smoldered back. He'd held Brooke, pretending to forgive, but deep down, every touch was a cut. Every smile a reminder of the wound the woman had unwittingly inflicted on Taylor Hayes, the mother who'd collapsed from abandonment. Los Angeles never forgets, and Forrester Creations has never been a place for peaceful souls. News of Hope Logan and Liam Spencer spread through the city like a flame licking through silk. Thomas heard about their wedding, about the child he'd loved like flesh and blood, about the dream stolen. He returned just in time for Hope's wedding dress to be adjusted for the final time, as if he'd been destined to witness the happiness he'd never held. One wonders if Thomas came to bless or to break. In his heart, the love for Hope never died, it just changed shape. From light to dark, from desire to obsession. Thomas's love was never a gentle thing, it was like a wound that would never heal, and instead of healing, he chose to deepen it. When Hope smiled at Liam, Thomas stood far away, his hands trembling in the light, and the world around him distorted like a cracked mirror. He remembered the old promises, remembered the look in Hope's eyes when she chose someone else, and in that silence, a part of his soul began to crack like porcelain. Thomas had tried to forget Hope by seeking out Paris Buckingham, the woman who had believed she could love him enough to save him from himself. But Paris's love was not strong enough to overcome Hope's ghost. Long nights in the luxury apartment, Paris heard Thomas whispering in her dreams, calling someone else's name. Every time she touched him, he saw a different face. It wasn't betrayal, it was the surrender of a stolen heart. And when that relationship fell apart, Thomas fell into a space between madness and awakening. He lost Paris, his father, his mother, his child, and now he returned empty-handed and with a mind that was slowly cracking with memories. Forrester Creations, where he had once created designs that made the world bow, now looked at him like a stain. Dick Sharp stood in the place Thomas had once stood, and between them was an undeclared war. Dick looked young and talented, but he didn't understand that Thomas never fought with just design, he fought with obsession. HFTF, the brand Hope had once represented, where Thomas had poured his soul, was now the battlefield. He walked in, no greeting needed, just a look. And in that look, Dick saw threat, Ridge Forrester, a father who both wanted to protect and feared his son, felt a chill in the air as Thomas walked through the door. Ridge knew his son knew the conflict between genius and evil inside him and knew that even the smallest spark could burn Forrester to death. But what Ridge didn't know was that Thomas had returned not just for work, but for something screaming in his head, the promise that love wasn't over, that Hope's happiness was still his if he dared enough. In the distance, Taylor Hayes lived her days alone, her mind torn between past and present. She heard the news of Thomas's return, and her heart sank. She had thought her son's love for Hope was just a scar, but now it was back like a festering wound. Deacon Sharp, the newcomer to her life, could be her support, but Taylor knew no one could keep Thomas safe except himself. And that was the scary thing because Thomas had never known how to save himself. Outside, Los Angeles was a golden stage where the light hid the decay within. Thomas wandered the streets, looking in windows, seeing Hope and Liam in FC posters, and in his mind, the line between fantasy and reality dissolved. He imagined Hope calling him back. He heard his heart skip a beat, and in that moment, Thomas could no longer tell what was real and what was memory. He began to sketch Hope's face, each line drawn with obsession, each brushstroke bearing the traces of pain. The drawings piled up, eyes resembling Hope's, but more distorted, darker, as if he were drawing his own destruction. Rumors spread that Thomas would attend Hope and Liam's wedding. Some said he wanted to bless. Others said he brought a new design, a wedding gift for Hope. But in Thomas's world, a gift and a curse were only a breath apart. As the wedding was being prepared in the Garden of Light, no one noticed a figure standing in the crowd, eyes watching the bride with an eerie stillness. Liam held Hope's hand, smiling, but Hope sensed something was wrong. It felt like an invisible string was being pulled between her and someone else. And as the wedding dress shimmered in the sunlight, Thomas's gaze pierced the white fabric like fire through ice. Paris Buckingham appeared in the distance, eyes watching Thomas with a mixture of fear and pity. She knew the man better than anyone, the man who always wanted to love. But every time he loved, he destroyed everything. Paris knew if Thomas didn't control himself, Forrester would fall into crisis again, and Hope would be the first victim. Everything exploded when Thomas took the stage, in the middle of Ridge's speech about family and forgiveness. No one understood why he appeared, only saw his fiery gaze, saw the veins on his wrists, saw his rapid breathing like someone who had just run away from himself. He said nothing, just placed on the table a small box. Inside was a wedding dress design called Redemption, but hidden in every stitch was an obsession that had never died. The room was silent. Brooke looked at Ridge, Ridge looked at Taylor, Taylor looked at Hope, and Hope looked straight at Thomas, her eyes wavering between pity and fear. From that moment, no one was sure if Thomas had returned to make amends or to rekindle the nightmare. Every sign in him was contradictory, between light and darkness, between love and obsession, between genius and destruction. Forrester Creations was once again standing on the edge of the abyss, where every decision could turn into tragedy. When night fell, Thomas returned to the empty room, opened the unfinished drawing, and looked in the mirror opposite. The face reflected back was no longer him, but countless versions of himself, a madman, lover, traitor, savior, all overlapping, swirling in the pale light. He closed his eyes, listening to the sound of his heartbeat mixed with the sound of needles, the sound of fabric pulling, Hope's laughter, his father calling his name, his mother sobbing. All of it harmonized into a distorted melody, signaling that Thomas Forrester had never really left. He had only waited for the right moment to return, stronger, more dangerous, and more real than ever. But the cold question still hung in the air, like a thread of blood connecting two worlds. When light and dark became one, could Thomas love without destroying? Or was he merely preparing for his final design, a work called The Salvation of the Man?